Picture the kitchen you grew up in, not a photograph of it. The room itself, the one that still lives somewhere inside you. Give it a moment. The table and the chair that always scraped. The light coming through the same window it always came through. The exact color of the walls, which you never once decided to remember. Someone else is in the room with you. Where are they standing? Now, one quiet question about the scene you're holding. Where are you? For a great many people, the answer is strange. They aren't behind their own eyes, looking out. They're across the room, watching a younger version of themselves at that table. A vivid, convincing memory, seen from a place they could never have stood. A camera angle with no camera. That doesn't make the memory false. Something real almost certainly happened in that room. But the image you're looking at right now wasn't simply replayed from storage. Part of it is being built, here, in the present, as you remember it. The past can feel like something you reach back to find. Some of it is something you make as you look. Everyone has one. A memory so clear you'd stake almost anything on it. The kind a brother or sister insists went a different way, and you know they've got it wrong because you can still see it, still hear it, still feel the room it happened in. That certainty isn't something you argue yourself into. It arrives whole, already finished, as a feeling. This happened, and it happened like this. It's worth stopping on that feeling because of what it actually is. When a memory is vivid, we take the vividness as proof. The sharper the picture, the surer we are that it's true. It seems almost too obvious to question. A clearer memory should be a truer one. But clarity and accuracy are two different things. One is an experience happening inside you, right now. The other is a claim about something that happened somewhere else, a long time ago. And the mind manufactures that feeling of certainty on its own. It never holds the feeling up against the world to check it before handing it to you, which makes something ordinary and a little unsettling possible. You can remember something with your whole body, feel completely sure of it, and be wrong. Not because you were careless, not because you're lying, but because of the way remembering works. To understand how a sincere, careful person can be certain and mistaken at the same time, we have to start somewhere that sounds almost too small to matter. We have to ask what your mind is actually doing in the moment it remembers. It feels like retrieval. You want the memory, you reach. And there it is, a scene, more or less whole, as if you'd pulled open a drawer and lifted out a photograph that had been waiting for you. The whole thing is built to feel effortless and finished. That is exactly why it fools us. Think about what would have to be true for memory to work like a recording. Every detail of every moment captured, stored intact, held unchanged for decades, ready to play back on command. Nothing in the brain works like that. There is no film, no drawer, no file sitting untouched in the dark, exactly where you left it. What there is instead is pieces. A fragment of how something looked, a trace of how it felt, the gist of what it meant. And when you remember, your mind takes those pieces and does something quietly astonishing with them. It builds a scene. It fills the gaps with what usually happens, with what you expected, with what you know about rooms like that and people like those. And the seams never show. You aren't handed the fragments and the guesses in separate piles. You're handed a finished picture and told it's the past. Nearly a century ago, a researcher tested this, on purpose and with great patience. He gave people a strange, unfamiliar story, then asked them to tell it back, again and again, over days and weeks. The story didn't simply fade, it shifted. The odd details fell away. The parts that didn't fit were quietly swapped for parts that did. With every retelling, it grew smoother, more familiar, more like something the teller already believed, and less like the thing they'd actually read. Hold on to that, because everything else grows out of it. When you remember, you aren't opening a drawer. You're doing construction work, assembling a version of the past out of fragments and expectation from the ground up every single time. And anything that can be built differently. Start small. If remembering is reconstruction, then the pieces you build from matter. and some of those pieces can arrive after the moment is already over. In one of the most repeated experiments in the study of memory, people watched a short film of a car crash. Afterwards, they were asked one simple thing: how fast were the cars going when they hit each other? Except the question wasn't the same for everyone. For some, the cars had hit. For others, they'd smashed. For a few, they'd bumped or contacted. One verb swapped out. Nothing else touched. The people who heard smashed remembered the cars going faster. The word had leaned on the memory, and it didn't stop at a number. A week later, those same people were asked whether they'd seen any broken glass at the scene. The ones who'd heard smashed were more likely to say yes, to picture the glass scattered across the road. There was no broken glass. This is the misinformation effect, and it's one of the sturdiest findings we have. Information that arrives after an event, a single word, a leading question, a detail dropped by someone else, can work its way into your memory of that event until you can't tell it apart from what you actually saw. It doesn't feel like suggestion. It feels like remembering. It's worth being careful here because it's easy to overstate. This doesn't mean one word rewrites everyone's memory, or that you're defenseless against every stray phrase. It depends on the wording, on how believable the new detail is, on how much time has passed. But under the right conditions, it's reliable enough to reproduce on purpose in a room full of perfectly ordinary people. A question asked afterward can change the answer to what happened before. And in life, the misleading detail almost never arrives just once from a stranger. It arrives again and again from the people we trust most, and every time we go back to the memory, we get one more chance to fold it in. We assume the memories we visit most are the ones we keep safest. The story told 100 times, the moment you return to again and again. Surely those are the most secure, worn smooth with handling, protected by all that use. It may be closer to the opposite, and it begins with a strange fact about what happens the instant a memory is used. Calling a memory to mind doesn't only read it. Under certain conditions, it appears to reopen it, to return part of it to a state where it can be quietly adjusted before it's put back. A lot of the clearest evidence for this comes from animal studies, so we should be careful about how far to carry it into human life. But the shape of the idea stays with you once you've seen it. The very act of remembering may be one of the moments a memory is most exposed. You don't need a laboratory to feel it. Every family has a story. The funny one, the one told at every table, every holiday, in almost exactly the same words, until the evening someone glances up and says quietly, "That's not how I remember it." Listen to your own most told story sometime. Notice how it's become a performance. The pauses land. The lines you keep are the ones that get a laugh. Somewhere along the way, you stopped remembering the event and started remembering the last time you told it. With each telling, it grew a little more confident, a little more polished, and without anyone noticing, a little further from the thing it started as. What looks like a memory being reinforced can also be a memory being edited. None of this means every recollection is corrupted or that you should distrust anything you've thought about twice. Most of the drift is tiny, but it changes what a memory is. It isn't a stone you take out and set back unchanged. It's closer to a sentence you rewrite a little each time you say it out loud, usually to make it clearer, occasionally to make it wrong. So far, all of this is still about details, a speed, a pane of glass, the polish on a story, which leaves the question that turns everything. If suggestion and retelling can change the details of something that happened, can they build the memory of something that didn't? To find out, researchers did something bold and a little uncomfortable. They went to people's own families. They gathered a handful of true stories from someone's childhood and slipped in one that wasn't true. A small, ordinary, believable event. In the best-known version, getting lost in the shopping mall as a little kid, the panic, the forest of adult legs, an older stranger who finally takes your hand and walks you back. It never happened, but it's exactly the kind of thing that could have. Then they simply asked people to remember it, not once, gently, more than once, over weeks, with a trusted relative nodding along, saying yes, it was real. Some of them did, not all. This is the part that matters, and the part that's easiest to get wrong. Only a portion of people came to accept the invented afternoon, and researchers still argue about how large that portion is, and how you should even count it. But for the ones who did, it wasn't a hazy maybe. They remembered. They added details no one had given them: the shop, the fear, the face of the person who helped. A whole afternoon in full color that had simply never taken place. Later work pushed harder, trading the story for a photograph, an old family picture quietly doctored to drop the person somewhere they'd never been. Handed their own faked photo, some people didn't just believe it. They remembered the day it seemed to show. Be precise about what this proves and what it doesn't. These false memories were of plausible events. They were coaxed out by repeated suggestion from a trusted source over time. Nobody has shown you can drop any memory into any mind at will. The finding is narrower and stranger. The same machinery that rebuilds a real event can, under the right pressure, assemble one that never occurred and hand it over feeling exactly like all the rest. Which opens a quieter, more personal door. If a whole event can be built like this in a laboratory in a matter of weeks, what about the events built across a whole lifetime in the one stretch of your past that not one of us can go back and check? There's a strange blank at the start of every life. Almost no one can reach anything from their first 2 or 3 years, and what comes just after is thin, a handful of frames, scattered and dim. It's called childhood amnesia, and it's universal. The same brain that was learning a language, a face, an entire world in those years, wasn't yet keeping the kind of durable, personal memory you can walk back into as an adult. And yet most of us carry something vivid from very early on. A birthday, a beach, a grandparent, gone now, lit by one particular afternoon. If the machinery for keeping those wasn't fully running yet, where did they come from? Often from outside the memory itself. From a photograph looked at so many times, the picture quietly became the memory. From a story told and retold across the dinner table until you could see it in detail, though you were far too small to have kept it yourself. The mind is not good at labeling where a scene came from. A picture you were shown, a story you were told, a thing you actually lived. They can all end up filed in the same place, marked remembered. The source falls away, only the scene stays. The psychologist Jean Piaget carried one of these his whole life and told it as his own. A clear, detailed memory of an attempted kidnapping from his pram when he was tiny, the crowd pressing in, the scratches on the face of the nurse who fought the man off. One of his earliest memories and one of his most certain. Years later, the nurse confessed. She had invented the whole thing. There had been no kidnapping. And still he had remembered it, in color, for most of his life. An afternoon assembled, start to finish, out of a story he'd been told. So go back to the kitchen you built a few minutes ago and ask, gently, where each piece of it came from. The table, the light, the person standing across the room. How much of it is the room itself, and how much is a photograph off a shelf, a story you were handed, a face you know so well from pictures that your mind simply set it down inside a scene it may never have been part of? This isn't a reason to mourn your childhood or to decide none of it was real. Almost all of it was. It's only to notice that the line between what you remember and what you've been told about yourself is far softer than it feels from the inside. And that softness doesn't stop at the edge of your own family. When two people remember an event the same way, it lands like proof. Two separate recordings agreeing. Surely that settles it. It's one of the most natural instincts we have. It's also the moment memory stops being private and becomes something we do together. The trouble is that the two recordings were never separate. When people who saw the same thing talk about it afterward, and people always talk about it afterward, their memories start drifting toward each other. One person mentions a detail, the others take it in and later remember seeing it with their own eyes. Researchers have caught this happening in real time. Two people watch slightly different versions of the same scene, talk it over, and afterward, each of them reports things they never actually saw, things that came from the other one's version. It feels completely like their own memory. It was borrowed. They call it memory conformity and social contagion, and once you know the shape of it, you start seeing it everywhere. The confident voice in the room, the detail repeated until it sets like concrete. The uncle whose version of a family event simply becomes the version, not because it's the most accurate, but because it's the most often told. Families don't just share memories, They build them together, sanding down the disagreements until everyone remembers the same agreed-upon scene. You've almost certainly met the biggest form of this without a name for it. Those strange moments when huge numbers of strangers all remember the same thing, a line from a film, a logo, a face, in exactly the same wrong way. It's become a piece of internet folklore. The phenomenon is real and studied, but the folklore isn't the evidence. The evidence is in the quieter rooms, where a single false detail can be watched moving from one person to the next, like a cold going around a family. So agreement doesn't confirm a memory the way we assume it does. Sometimes it only means the memory spread. And if a whole room of people, sincere, certain, sure, can settle together on the same mistake, then certainty itself is going to need a much harder look. Some memories don't feel like the others. The moment you learned that something enormous had happened, a disaster, a death, an attack that stopped the world. People say those ones are burned in, permanent, exact. They can tell you the room, the light, the exact person who turned and told them, and they say it without a flicker of doubt. Researchers have followed memories like these for years, returning to the same people and asking them to tell the same moment again and again. And they found a split that shouldn't be possible. The confidence stays high, the vividness stays high, the account does not. Where you were, who was with you, how the news reached you, these quietly rearrange themselves, while the feeling of certainty never moves. In some cases, people were shown their own words, written down in the first days, and didn't recognize them. The handwriting was theirs, the memory it described was not the one they now carried, and some trusted the memory over the page in their own hand. So the feeling of certainty isn't measuring accuracy, it's doing something else entirely. And nowhere did the stakes of that come clearer than in a single documented case. In 1984, a young woman named Jennifer Thompson survived an attack in her own home. In the dark, in the middle of the worst night of her life, she made a decision of remarkable presence of mind. She would study the man, his face, his voice, anything she could hold, so that if she lived, she could make sure he was caught. She lived, and she identified a man named Ronald Cotton. She picked him from a spread of photographs. She picked him again from a lineup. She testified, and he was convicted, and she was certain. But her certainty didn't stay where it began. Across the months, the photographs, the questions, the quiet reassurances from the people around her that she'd chosen right, it grew. By the time she faced Ronald Cotton in a courtroom, she was surer than she'd been in the first raw instant. That growth is the thing to watch. More than a decade later, DNA evidence that hadn't existed at the trial was finally tested. It showed that Ronald Cotton had not committed the crime. Another man had. Cotton, who had spent those years in prison for something he did not do, walked out. Jennifer Thompson had not lied and had not been careless. She had done everything we picture a good witness doing. She paid attention, she fought to remember, she told the truth as she knew it. And she was completely, sincerely wrong. Hers is not a story about a bad witness. It's a story about what memory can do to a good one. And it turns on a nuance that matters, because the lesson is not that confidence is worthless. The confidence a witness feels in the very first moment of an identification, before anyone has told them whether they were right, before the memory has been repeated and reinforced, can carry real information about whether they're correct. It's the confidence that comes afterward, hardened by feedback and retelling, that stops meaning what we think it means. The certainty Jennifer Thompson carried to the witness stand was not the certainty she'd felt in that first instant. It had been built, the same way every memory is built. And then the part that turns the whole story over. In the years after his release, Cotton and Thompson met, and instead of looking away from one another, they turned toward the thing that had happened between them. They came to know each other, and they began to speak, together, in public, about how a mistake like this is really made, not by monsters, by an ordinary mind doing its ordinary, everyday work. By now, a reasonable person might feel a little betrayed by their own mind. If a memory can be tilted by a word, worn smooth by retelling, seeded with entire events passed between people, and held with total conviction while it quietly goes wrong, why would we be built this way? What kind of design is this? The answer is that it was never trying to be a recording. A recording has exactly one job: keep everything, precisely. But keeping everything is not the same as understanding any of it. A perfect, complete archive of your life would be an ocean of detail with the meaning drowned somewhere at the bottom. It could give you the exact words of 10,000 conversations and never once tell you which one changed your life. That is not what a mind needs to get through a single ordinary day. So memory does something more useful and more dangerous. It keeps the gist and lets the surface go. It holds on to what things meant, how they felt, what they taught you, and quietly lets the rest slip. And it updates. When new information arrives, it doesn't file it away in a separate drawer. It blends it into what you already know, so your sense of the world stays current rather than staying exact. That flexibility isn't a fault in the system, it's the whole design. The same openness that let a false detail slip into a memory is the openness that lets you learn anything at all. And it does one more thing, maybe the deepest reason of all. More and more, researchers see remembering the past and imagining the future as two sides of a single ability. It's become one of the most compelling ways to understand what memory is really for, though it's a picture still being worked out, not a closed case. When you imagine tomorrow, a conversation you're dreading, a place you've never been, a version of your life that hasn't happened, you build it out of pieces of everything you've already lived, recombined into something new. A rigid recording could never do that. Only a memory loose enough to be pulled apart and put back together can be used to imagine at all. Which means the flaw and the gift are the same thing. A mind that could never misremember could also never plan, never hope, never rehearse a hard conversation on the walk to the door. The price of being able to imagine the future is a past that can quietly rearrange itself behind you. So go back one last time to that kitchen, the table, the light, the person standing across the room. You know a little more now about what you're holding. Some of it came from the room. Some came from a photograph on a shelf, or a story told so many times it quietly became yours. Some your own mind supplied without asking, because that is what minds do with a gap. The scene has almost certainly changed a little every time you've walked back into it, including just now. And none of that empties it out. The people in that room were real. What they meant to you was real. The person it helped make, that is real too, and it lasted precisely because your memory refused to keep everything. It kept what was worth keeping. A perfect recording could have preserved that kitchen forever, down to the last chip in the paint, and told you nothing about why you still go back there. Your memory did the opposite. It let the paint go. It kept the reason. You were never carrying a recording of your life. You were carrying its meaning, and meaning is the one thing a recording could never hold.